All right, so this is Unit 2, Ecology review, and going through the study guide and giving you information about ecology, the study of how organisms interact with them environment and also each other in their community and populations. So the first thing we discussed in our packet in our learning was the level of organization from the smallest thing going all the way up to the biggest thing on Earth. So I was going to talk about each one. So we have an atom, then we have a molecule, and then we have some organelles that work together to make a cell. And at that point, we are now in biotic factors. So we have a bunch of the same type of cell makes up a tissue. A bunch of the same type of tissue makes up an organ. A bunch of organs working together makes up an organ system. And a bunch of organ systems working together make up an organism. Now, when you have the same type of organism living together, we call that a population. When you have a population interacting with other populations, we call that a community. Now, all of this that I have said so far is biotic factors only. Biotic factors only. When we get to ecosystem, this is now all of the communities now interacting with their environment. So now we have the abiotic factors interacting with the biotic factors, the sun, the wind, the water, the rocks, the dirt. And then a bunch of ecosystems make up a biome, which then ultimately makes up our biosphere. So when we think about biotic and abiotic factors, we're thinking about the living and the not living parts of an ecosystem. So this fish, the deer, the bird, the frog, the cattails, plants, the lily pad, these ladybugs, this fern, all of those are biotic components of the ecosystem here in this picture. The abiotic factors, or the items that are not considered alive, would be the water, the sun, maybe the wind, some rocks. Those are things that are considered not living. All right, so when we look at types of biotic factors, there are two types of biotic factors. There are what we call autotrophs and heterotrophs. So when we think of the word autotrophs, we're thinking of organisms that make their own food. So they use a process to make their own food, and there are two processes that they can go through. And so one is called photosynthesis. And so photosynthesis, again, photo means sunlight, so they need light. Syn means together, so they're going to take light and they're going to take carbon dioxide and water, and together they're going to make food. They're going to make energy for themselves. So they're making food inside of themselves. And some types, and most autotrophs go through photosynthesis. And so here's an example of some organisms that go through photosynthesis. Plants like sunflowers, algae in waters, different types of bacteria that are photosynthetic bacteria can go through photosynthesis, and a couple other organisms in the ocean. Now, there is autotrophs that are not exposed to light. They're in a very extreme environment, and so they can go through something called chemosynthesis instead of photosynthesis. And so chemosynthesis, the main difference is that instead of using light to make food, they use chemicals to make their own food. And so but most autotrophs are photosynthetic organisms. It's usually only bacteria that are chemosynthetic organisms. So when we talk about a heterotroph, hetero means different. So we need a different variety of foods. We need to go and eat our food. And so we can also call them consumers. And so there's a few types of consumers that are in our world. A carnivore, for example, is a consumer that only eats meats. So that would be like a lion as a carnivore. A herbivore is an organism that only eats plants. So that would be like a cow. An omnivore is an organism that eats both plants and animals, and that's kind of like us. We eat plants and animals. A scavenger is another type of consumer that will go and get um, food once something else has killed it. And then a decomposer is usually bacteria. They break down decaying dead organisms and use their energy. So we have autotroph versus heterotroph. So to remind you that if you look at this picture, this is a food web looking at the autotrophs and heterotrophs interacting, and this is a food chain. You can see the big difference. A food web is interconnected, interwoven, lots of lines, lots of complex pathways happening. And so there's several food chains in a food web. If you look at a food chain, it is one single line pathway following where the energy is going. So both of these are looking at where the energy is going. So if you look at this food chain, we have the sun's energy is going into the leaf's energy is going into the grasshopper, the grasshopper's energy is going to go into the frog, and the frog is going to go into this bird. Now we can name these organisms. We call these trophic levels, and we can name them. So for example, this plant would be an autotroph or a producer, okay? We could name, though, this frog as well. So the plant would be primary producer, the grasshopper would be a primary consumer, and the frog then would be what we call a secondary consumer. It is the second thing eating in the food chain. So we can label those as well. So when we look at energy, like I said, in these food chains, they flow in one direction. So energy flows through to the very end, and then it's used up. Matter does not. Matter does not flow in one way. It is a cycle. So it can start in the air, cycle through living and non-living things, and come back out to the air. And usually the reason why it does that is because it's just transforming and changing. It's transforming from a gas to a solid to a liquid, back to a gas, back to a solid. So it's just transforming and changing. The carbon is an example of matter that can cycle through our biosphere. So carbon can go into a plant, we can eat the plant, we can respire, which we can go through respiration and exhale out the carbon. Carbon can get into the ground because of decaying material. Organisms can die and decay down, and then over millions of years it can become a fossil fuel, and then we burn that fossil fuel and release the carbon back out. Nitrogen is another type of matter that can cycle through our biosphere, and so the most important organism involved in the nitrogen cycle are bacteria. They are the ones that fix nitrogen for us. So bacteria can go through nitrogen fixation, which is basically just fixing it from a nitrogen gas to a different form. You don't need to know the name, but you do need to know that it has to be fixed and changed so that plants can take it in. And then when we eat the plants, that's when we can get that nitrogen. And then there's other type of bacteria that can go through denitrification, which is basically the complete opposite of taking the usable form of nitrogen and converting it back out into nitrogen gas. All right, so that was a little bit about chapter 3. Moving into chapter 4, the first part was talking about the difference between weather and climate. And so weather is our day-to-day conditions. The amount of rain we got today, the temperature is 52 degrees outside, the wind is 15 miles per hour. That's all it's describing weather. Climate is a longer periods of time over an average. So you could say like the winter season had 28 inches of snow, or This world climate at this point is tropical. Those are examples of climate when you're looking at a long periods of time. So there is a word called niche that's describing what an organism's job or role is in the environment. And I provided the example of a paca in the tropical rainforest. Paca's main job or role is to be seed dispensers. They plant seeds in the ground because that's where they try to hide them. And so a niche is just what's the organism's job or role in the environment. That's what you ask yourself when you learn about different organisms. And so that leads us to symbiosis. Sym is a root word meaning together, and bio means life. So it's living organisms living closely together in a relationship. And so there are three types of symbiosis. There's mutualism, where both species benefit from the relationship. They both are needed to survive together, and they're both happy, essentially. There's also parasitism. This is when one species benefits but the other is super harmed. And so that is a parasitism relationship, like a mosquito and a human. And then commensalism is the other type of symbiosis relationship. And commensalism is usually referring to how one species is really benefiting from the relationship, but the other is completely neutral, does not care, isn't harmed by anything, and can just be without it. It doesn't necessarily need it. So we move into the last part of the learning in chapter 4, which is called ecological succession. It's basically when a disturbance happens in the ecosystem and changes the environment, where they essentially have to regrow back. So there's two types of ecological succession. The first one is called primary succession. So primary succession is when you have bare rock from the disturbance. So an example could be a lava flow, it could be a glacier melting, a glacier retreat, and so you are left with bare rock. And so you have to reestablish the ecosystem by beginning with pioneer species like lichens, where they break up the rock, they turn it into soil, and then over time, soil starts to become part of the ecosystem, and that allows things to grow and grow and grow until it reaches something called a climax community, where you have mature trees again, and you're back to the same ecosystem. So that's primary succession. Secondary succession is when you have a disturbance like a fire or a flood, where you still have soil. You still have a couple of living things left. And so yes, pioneer species come in, but they're different because there's already soil there, and so they don't have to start with bare rock. And it's a little bit less time to get back to a climax community of those mature trees. So you need to remember the root words of this unit. A means not, auto means self, carbo means contains carbon, chem means chemical, eco means house or habitat, geo means earth, hetero means different, photo means light, sim means together, and troph means food. So in order to be successful in the test, I think going over chapters 3.1 through 3.4 and chapter 4.1 through 4.3, reviewing your notes, your lab activities, the land to mouth, going outside, looking at the levels of organization on page 1, the trophic levels, looking at the types of trophic levels that exist. And so that would be the types of ecological pyramids, the pyramid of energy, the pyramid of biomass, and the pyramid of numbers. Looking at how specifically the pyramid of energy, this was in your notes, where most of the energy is released as heat. 90% of the energy is because it's used by the organism or released as heat. Only 10% of the energy moves up each trophic level in a food chain. So remembering those notes, and then remembering to look at your cycles, matter cycles, and your succession article, and of course the root words.